And now on the line from Brussels is Felix Klann. Felix is the Shipping Policy Officer with TNE, and TNE stands for Transport and Environment, and they are Europe's leading advocates for clean transport and energy. Felix, welcome to Near FM.
Pleasure to be here. Thank you for having me.
Okay, Felix, yourselves and TNE issued a report recently on the carbon emissions at European ports, and I read an article on Dublin People's social media about it yesterday, and I was shocked to read what your report said about Dublin Port. Before we talk more about Dublin Port specifically, can you, Felix, begin by giving me a bit of a summary of who T&E are, and then give me a bit of an overview on your recent report, please?
Absolutely, and So before we get into the details, the T&E we're clean shipping advocates. We're an NGO based in Brussels, working on all different types of transport, so anything from cities, trucks, ships, planes. I'm in our shipping team where we try to sort of decarbonize the entire sector, not just ferries, which is the topic of our newest report, but all the different cargo-focused sectors as well. Now, the report we just recently published yesterday focuses on the ferry sector because it's quite unique in that it's, on the one hand, it's quite old, as in, ferries have been around, but the individual ship is also quite old compared to other shipping segments, meaning older ships, more pollution, higher fuel costs and all these types of things. But also they're unique because they operate almost entirely in Europe. There's little competition outside of Europe, and they operate very close to European populations and port cities. So when we talk about container ships, for example, we talk about greenhouse gases and ocean pollution. But when we talk about ferries, the air pollution that comes from them in your ports, Dublin, Piraeus, Rotterdam, you name them, which is a quite unique concern to this segment.
Go ahead, yeah, okay. I was shocked to read about Dublin. Can you tell me a bit more about how bad Dublin Port is, Felix?
Yeah, right. I mean, Dublin is a port with quite high ferry traffic. So that means, and also, if I remember correctly, with quite old ferry fleet, meaning the pollution from the individual ferry could also be quite high. I don't have the exact number right in front of me, but what it's safe to say that the air pollution that comes from the ferries in Dublin is sort of orders of magnitude higher than that from the city's cars, which is something that often flies below the radar, how just a few very large ships can cause air pollution equivalent to all the smaller, much more focused upon road traffic.
Yeah, because we hear a lot about airplanes, don't we, and the carbon emissions they have, but ships are actually worse, are they? Well, some ships.
Some ships can be. I mean, if you compare the sector, you can mostly compare absolute numbers because they do very different operations. But shipping is usually accredited about 3% of global emissions, which is, might look like a small number, but if you compare it to, for example, national emissions, that's more than an entire industries or larger industries. I think it's roughly at par with the German national emissions in total across industrial sectors. And ferries within that are a fairly decent share, especially in Europe, where we have the most ferries, in one global region. So safe to say, if we talk about decarbonizing transport, this is one of the major angles that we need to be concerned about. Yes.
I was shocked to read the article on Dublin People social media written by Paul Conlon yesterday about your report about Dublin. But Felix, am I right in saying that Dublin Port and the other ports in Europe will actually be moving in the right direction over the next few years, and that this will make a big difference?
To an extent, yes. So to understand maritime fuels, they're significant, or maritime diesel, they're significantly more polluting, as in higher sulfur content than what we see on the road, for example. So if you compare cars that are covered by the Euro 8 norm now, the air pollution that is not greenhouse gases, but air pollution is much lower than what we see from ships. And the sector is much less regulated when it comes to the cleanliness and purity of the fuel they're bunkering. So what's going to come soon is the North Atlantic emission control area, which introduces a sort of new low sulfur fuel standard to ships sailing in these regions. And that is definitely an improvement. Just to be very clear, that will help. However, it will not bring the maritime fuels up to the standard that we see on road. Apologies. So it is better, but it's not good enough yet, and crucially, it doesn't get us hitched off fossil fuels in any way. It just means that the fossil fuels will continue to lose are slightly cleaner compared to how they are right now. So it's less bad, is how I would phrase it.
But like over the next few years, like if ships are getting replaced, they have the option of going electric, do they?
Exactly. That is a separate trend. So the fuel standard matters for the ships that don't switch. But and that is what our report focuses on. There's actually a huge potential for electric shipping and electric ferries in particular. There's really two drivers behind this. On the one side, batteries are getting cheaper and cheaper. And indeed, when we closed the analysis in our report, we were a bit frustrated to see that reality has already overtaken us. So right now, there's battery producers for marine that are cheaper than what we assumed in our own analysis. So you can see really how fast the transitions are. And first ferries are already being ordered in the Nordic, for example, that run fully electric or hybrid electric. And that's a huge potential that requires very little sort of policy adjustments. It can be boosted, it can be supported, but there's a lot of evidence and more real life examples where electric ferries are not only cleaner, but they're also cost competitive with their fossil counterparts.
So the challenge is it to kind of persuade people who own ships to buy electric ships, is it?
The challenge is to persuade. There's still some sort of concerns about safety, batteries on water and all that. And those are those are solved. It's engineering concerns. Those are solved. We now see mass production of maritime batteries. But of course, it takes some time to sort of convince hearts and minds, if you want to put it that way. The other big bottleneck is power demand and infrastructure. So the problem is solved on board of the ships. But of course, these ferries need to connect. They need to charge. Which means ports need to invest in their grids and ports need to invest in charging points. It's a very similar situation to electric cars, let's say a decade ago. We think that is definitely a very achievable goal, though, for multiple reasons. On the one hand, a lot of ports have to look at their electricity systems anyway. The European Union's FIA regulation mandates onshore power connections for different other ship segments, but it means from an infrastructure perspective, most larger ports are looking at investing grid improvements anyway, and adding sort of slowly growing shipping demand, or ferry demand, I should say, is really that huge difference, especially in the first years of adoption. And so from that perspective, there's a business model there. Ships want it. Electricity prices, even though they are quite high in the UK, are still more stable than fossil fuel prices and not subject to any sort of additional environmental fees and tariffs like the ETS or other liabilities. So really, especially if you look at the lifetime of a ferry, which can easily reach 20, 30, 40 years in some cases, that's a pretty safe and pretty reliable investment.
Yeah, in Ireland over the last few years, up until the end of 2024, the Green Party were in coalition government with Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael, and the Green Party were very successful in getting investment into public transport in Ireland, particularly because of the carbon emissions. So I was shocked to read Pádraig's article yesterday saying that, the carbon emissions in Dublin Port are actually worse than the whole city of Dublin. But things are maybe, with persuasion, on an upward trajectory. Do you think, Felix?
It sounds good. Admittedly, I'm not an expert on Dublin and Ireland's politics, but it makes sense. Ultimately, ferries, especially ferries to islands, or across the channel, are public transport infrastructure, even though they're sometimes commercially operated, or often. But it makes sense. And while the environmental argument was always on the side of electrification for a long time now, and when I say environmental, I mean climate, but I also mean health, local pollution, water pollution, indeed. But now we're getting closer and closer to a point, and in some cases we've reached already, where it also makes economic sense. We talked about fuel prices and taxes, but we can also talk about personnel costs. Electric engines and batteries themselves are usually lower maintenance. They usually require less staffing. And with some minor adjustment to sort of operating schedules and trainings, you can actually optimize ferry services. And that is something that is quite new. I think we've seen electric ferries or smaller ships as pilot tests, but we see commercial adoption really starting within the last 2-3 years. So that's, I would say the new push.
Okay, Felix, I'm thinking particularly of the owners of small ships, like small boats, whatever you want to call them. But like, who are the people who are going to persuade these people to go electric? Like yourselves or other people or the government, is it?
I mean, the government needs to set the right incentives and support where they can, be it via the port infrastructure, but also via setting the right standards. If there's public procurement involved, that public procurement has no reason not to go sort of green and introduce new environmental standards beyond just the cheapest offer, or the cheapest offer on a very short time scale. But who we're really trying to convince here is the ship owners themselves, or rather the ferry operators themselves. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean every small, 20-person inner port marine shuttle, even though they are easy to electrify, but they're hardly making the difference. It's nice to have, but what really matters are these what we call roll packs, so car and passenger ferries that sort of cross the channel, that go medium distances. Because there the technology is ready, those companies have the means to get proper loans and to make an investment that can pay off only in a decade. That is how the sector is already working anyway. So these ships have incredibly long return of investment times. And these ships often are old already, so they need to be replaced within the next couple of years, in many cases either way. And when that replacement comes around, we want to convince policymakers to set the right incentives, but ultimately ship owners, ship operators to make the investment in something that is clean and economical rather than something that is just short-term. That burns fossil fuels, is a bit cheaper in the short term, but will run into massive problems in the next decade or so.
Yeah, I'm surprised that there's not already a policy at this EU level. You're kind of advocating on that, yeah?
Yeah, so there are a couple of policies regulating shipping. There's the ETS, the emission trading system, that also applies to shipping. There's FuelEU as a fuel standard. But a lot of these policies currently only apply to larger ships, larger than 5,000 gross tonnage. That applies to some very large ferries. Think Calais-Dover crossings, these massive things. But it usually leaves out the majority of the ferry sector, where you saw talking sort of medium-sized ferries above 400 gross tonnage is the term that would be used in the industry. So the policies exist, they just carve out niches and exceptions that currently apply to the ferry sector quite often. And if these are closed, it would definitely set the right incentives, and especially if they're combined with certain sort of positive reinforcement incentives, then there's really nothing stopping this. At the moment, I would say that ferries didn't have to wonder about regulation, and often could say, like, because the public transport, they're a very integral sector that shouldn't be pushed into sort of suboptimal solutions. Which was partly true to an extent up until a couple of years ago. But now the solutions are there, so the policy needs to sort of expand and align accordingly. I think, one thing I think is quite important is that when we talk about these clean technologies, it all sounds quite futuristic, battery-powered ships. We're talking about tons and tons of batteries. But I think it's important to say that really everybody I talk to, industry, policymaker, and environmental NGOs like myself, we're really of one mind when it comes to possibilities. So this is something that is both developed, produced, implemented in some cases, and desired by ship owners. And policymakers actually see, it's a rare positive story where they say they actually can see this promoted properly as well. So now it's less about sort of proving a case, it's more about scaling it properly and not being sort of doubtful at the wrong moment. So here, it's rare that I don't fight with my industry counterparts, and this is one of the topics where I don't. And I think that's a very, very good sign.